Classics to read aloud to your children. The Golden Touch, Part 2. The golden touch had come to him with the first sunbeam. Midas bolted up in a kind of joyful frenzy and ran about the room, grasping at everything that happened to be in his way. He seized one of the bedposts, and it became immediately a wondrous golden pillar. He pulled aside a window curtain in order to shed more light on the wonders he was performing, and the tassel grew heavy in his hand, a mass of gold. He hurriedly put on his clothes and was enraptured to see himself in a magnificent suit of gold cloth, which retained its flexibility and softness, although it burdened him a little with its weight. He drew out his handkerchief, which little Marigold had hemmed for him. That was likewise gold, with the dear child's neat and pretty stitches running all along the border in gold thread. Somehow or other, this last transformation did not quite please King Midas. He would rather that his little daughter's handiwork could have remained just the same as when she climbed his knee and put it into his hand. But it was not worthwhile to worry himself about so small a complaint as this. Midas now took his spectacles from his pocket and put them on his nose, in order that he might see more distinctly what he was doing. To his great astonishment, however, he discovered that he could not possibly see through them. The transparent lenses had turned to plates of yellow metal, and of course were worthless as spectacles, though valuable as gold. It struck Midas as rather inconvenient that, with all his wealth, he could never again be rich enough to own a pair of serviceable eyeglasses. "It is no great matter anyway," he said to himself very philosophically. "We cannot expect any great good without there being some accompanying inconvenience. The golden touch is worth the sacrifice of a pair of eyeglasses at least, if not one's very eyesight. My own eyes will serve for ordinary purposes, and little Marigold will soon be old enough to read to me." Midas then went out into the garden and found a great number of beautiful roses in full bloom and others in all stages of lovely bud and blossom. But Midas knew a way to make them far more precious, according to his way of thinking, than roses had ever been before. He took great pains in going from bush to bush as he exercised his magic touch, until every individual flower and bud, and even the worms at the heart of some of them, had been changed to gold. By the time this good work was completed, King Midas was summoned to breakfast. The morning air had given him an excellent appetite, and he hurried back to the palace. Little Marigold had not yet made her appearance. Her father ordered her to be called, and, seating himself at the table, awaited the child's coming so that he could begin his own breakfast. To do Midas justice, it must be said that he really loved his daughter, and he loved her so much the more this morning on account of the good fortune that had befallen him. It was not long before he heard her coming along the passageway crying bitterly. Midas was surprised to hear this, because Marigold was one of the most cheerful little people you could ever imagine, and hardly shed a thimbleful of tears in a year. When Midas heard her sobs, he determined to put little Marigold into better spirits, and leaning across the table, he touched his daughter's bowl, which was a china one with pretty figures all around it, and transformed it to a gleaming gold. Marigold slowly opened the door, still sobbing as if her heart would break. "There now, my little lady," cried Midas, "what in the world is the matter with you this morning?" Marigold held out her hand, in which was one of the roses that Midas had so recently changed to gold. "Beautiful!" exclaimed her father. "And what is there in this magnificent golden rose to make you cry?" "Oh, dear father," answered the child, as well as her sobs would let her, "it is the ugliest flower that ever grew. As soon as I was dressed, I ran into the garden to gather some roses for you, because I know you like them, and like them even better when I gather them for you. But oh dear, dear me, what do you think has happened? Such a misfortune. All the beautiful roses that smelled so sweet and had so many lovely blushes are spoiled and grown quite yellow. As you can see this one, they no longer have any fragrance. What can be the matter with them?" Now, my dear little girl, let's not cry about something like this," said Midas, who was ashamed to confess that he himself had wrought the change which so greatly afflicted her. Sit down and eat your hot cereal. You will find it easy enough to exchange a golden rose like that, which will last the hundreds of years, for an ordinary one that wouldn't wither in a day." "But I don't care for roses like this," cried Marigold, tossing it contemptuously away. "It has no smell, and the hard petals prick my nose." Midas, meanwhile, had poured out a cup of coffee, and as a matter of course, the coffee pot, whatever metal it may have been when he took it up, was gold when he set it back down. He lifted a spoonful of coffee to his lips, and, sipping it, was astonished to perceive that the instant his lips touched the liquid, it became molten gold, and the next moment hardened into a lump. Midas exclaimed, rather aghast. "What is the matter, father?" asked little Marigold, gazing at him with tears still standing in their eyes. "Nothing, child, nothing," said Midas. "Eat your breakfast before it gets too cold." He took one of the little sausages on his plate and, by way of experiment, touched it with his finger. To his horror, it was immediately transmuted from a link of pork into a tube of golden metal, so rigid that he could not pierce it with the suddenly golden fork he held in his hand. "I don't quite see how I'm going to get any breakfast," thought he. Almost in despair, he helped himself to a boiled egg, which immediately underwent a change similar to those of the coffee and the sausage. The egg, indeed, might have been mistaken for one of those which the famous storybook goose was in the habit of laying, but King Midas was the only goose that had anything to do with this matter. "Well, this is a quandary," thought he, leaning back in his chair and looking quite enviously at little Marigold, who was now eating her hot cereal by milk with great satisfaction. "Such a costly breakfast before me, and I can't eat a single bite of it." He even tried eating very quickly, hoping he might in this way avoid what was becoming a considerable inconvenience. He snatched a hot potato and attempted to cram it into his mouth and swallow it before it had time to change form, but the golden touch was too nimble for him. He found his mouth full, not of soft potato, but of solid metal, which so burned his tongue that he roared aloud, and jumping from the table, began to dance and stamp about the room, both in pain and in fear. "Father, dear father," cried little Marigold, who was a very affectionate child, "have you burned your mouth?" "Ah, dear child," groaned Midas dolefully, "I don't know what is to become of your poor father." By now, Midas had grown quite hungry, and when he considered how ravenous he would be by supper time, and the likelihood that his dinner meal would be similarly indigestible, he began to doubt whether, after all, riches were the one desirable thing in the world, or even the most desirable. But this was only a passing thought. So fascinated was Midas with the glitter of the yellow metal that he would still have refused to give up the golden touch for such a paltry a consideration as a breakfast. Nevertheless, so great was his hunger and the perplexity of his situation that he again groaned aloud as if in serious pain. Our pretty Marigold couldn't endure it no longer. She sat a moment, gazing at her father and trying with all her wits to find out what the matter was with him. Then, with a sweet and sorrowful impulse to comfort him, she arose from her chair and, running to Midas, threw her arms affectionately about his knees. He bent down and kissed her. He felt that his little daughter's love was worth 1,000 times more than he had gained by the golden touch. "My precious, precious Marigold," cried he, but Marigold made no answer. Oh no, what had he done? How fateful was the gift the stranger had granted him. The moment the lips of Midas touched Marigold's forehead, a change took place. Her sweet, rosy face, so full of affection as it had been, assumed a glittery yellow color, with yellow teardrops congealing on her cheeks. Her beautiful brown curls took on the same tint. Her soft and tender little form grew hard and inflexible within her father's encircled arms. Oh, a terrible misfortune! The victim of his insatiable desire for wealth, little Marigold was a human child no longer, but a golden statue. Yes, there she was, with the questioning look of love, grief, and pity hardened into her face. It was the prettiest and most woeful sight that one could ever see. All the features and tokens of Marigold were there. Even the beloved little dimple remained in her golden chin. But the more perfect was the resemblance, the greater was the father's agony at beholding this golden image, which was all that was left of him of a daughter. It had been a favorite phrase of Midas's, whenever he felt particularly fond of the child, to say that she was worth her weight in gold, and now the phrase had become literally true. And now, at last, when it was too late, he felt how infinitely a warm and tender heart that loved him exceeded in value all the weight that could have been piled of wealth between the earth and the sky. While he was in this tumult of despair, he suddenly beheld a stranger standing near the door. Midas bent down his head without speaking, for he recognized that same figure who had appeared to him the day before in this treasure room, and had bestowed on him this disastrous power called the Golden Touch. "Well, friend Midas," said the stranger, "tell me, how have you gotten along with this gift you asked for?" "I am very miserable," said he. "Very miserable indeed," exclaimed the stranger, "and how can that be? Have I not faithfully kept my promise to you? Have you not everything that your heart desired?" "Gold is not everything," answered Midas, "and I have lost all that my heart really cared for." "Ah, so you have made a discovery since yesterday," observed the stranger. "Let us see then. Which of these two things do you think is really of greater worth? The gift of the golden touch, or 1 cup of clear, cold water?" "Oh, blessed water!" exclaimed Midas. "It will never moisten my parched throat again." "The golden touch," continued the stranger, "or a crust of bread." "A piece of bread," answered Midas, "is worth all the gold on earth." "The golden touch?" asked the stranger, "or your own little Marigold, warm, soft, and loving as she was an hour ago?" "Oh, my child, my dear child!" cried poor Midas, wringing his hands. "I would not have given that one small dimple in her chin for the power of changing this whole big earth into a solid lump of gold." "You are wiser than you were, King Midas," said the stranger, looking seriously at him. "Your own heart, I perceive, has not been entirely changed from flesh to gold. Were it so, your case would indeed be desperate. But you appear to still be capable of understanding that the commonest things, such as lie within everybody's grasp, are more valuable than the riches which so many mortals sigh and struggle after. Tell me now, do you sincerely desire to rid yourself of this golden touch?" "It is hateful to me," replied Midas. A fly settled on his nose, but fell immediately to the floor, for it too had become gold. Midas shuddered. "Go then," said the stranger, "and plunge into the river that glides past the bottom of your garden. Take a vase of that river water and sprinkle it over any object that you may desire, to change back from gold into its former substance. If you do this in earnestness and sincerity, it may possibly repair the mischief that your greed has brought about." Midas lost no time in snatching up a great earthen pitcher and hastening to the river bank. As he scampered along and forced his way through the shrubbery, it was positively marvelous to see how the foliage turned yellow behind him, as if the autumn had been there and nowhere else. On reaching the river, he plunged in headlong, without waiting to even pull off his clothes. "Poof, poof, poof," snorted King Midas, as his head emerged out of the water. "Well, this is really a refreshing bath, and I think it must have quite washed away the golden touch. And now to fill my pitcher." As he dipped the pitcher into the water, it gladdened his very heart to see it change from gold into the same good, honest earthen vessel which it had been before he touched it. Seeing a violet that grew on the bank of the river, Midas touched it with his finger and was overjoyed to find that the delicate flower retained its purple hue instead of undergoing a yellow blight. The curse of the golden touch had therefore really been removed from him. King Midas hastened back to the palace, and one can only imagine how surprised the servants must have been to see their royal master so carefully bringing home an earthen pitcher of water. Little did they know, that water, which was to undo all the mischief that his folly had brought about, was more precious to Midas than an ocean of molten gold could have ever been. The first thing he did, as you can well imagine, was to sprinkle it by handfuls over the golden figure of little Marigold. As it splashed upon her, he would have laughed to see how the rosy color came back to the dear child's cheek, how she began to sneeze and sputter, and how astonished she was to find herself dripping wet, and her father still throwing more water over her. "Please stop that, father," she cried. "See how you have soaked my nice frock, which I only put on this morning." For Marigold did not know that she had been a little golden statue, nor could she remember anything that had happened since the moment when she ran with outstretched arms to comfort poor King Midas. Her father did not think it necessary to tell his beloved child how very foolish she had been, but contented himself with showing how much wiser he had now grown. For this purpose, he led little Marigold into the garden, where he sprinkled all the remainder of the water over the rose bushes, and in an instant more than 5,000 roses recovered their bloom. Indeed, only one effect of the golden touch endured, and it served as a constant reminder to Midas of his former power and foolishness. Little Marigold's hair kept a noticeable tinge of gold, a hue he had never seen it in before his fateful kiss. When King Midas had grown quite an old man and made Marigold's children laugh by bouncing them on his knee, he was fond of telling them this marvelous story, and then he would stroke their heads and tell them that their hair likewise had a rich shade of gold, which they inherited from their mother. "And to tell you the truth, my precious little folks," Midas would say, diligently bouncing the children all the while, "ever since that morning I have hated the very sight of all other gold, except this."